who best characterized that was a woman of color, a woman of African descent from St. Paul that no one knew anything about. And what was strange about that to me was that she was a person who had actually walked those very halls of the state capitol, lobbying in 1921 for passage of an anti-lynching bill. Amazingly so, at that particular time, 1921, lynching was not a crime. She had lobbied the legislature and was successful in getting it passed. And I'll end tonight's presentation sort of talking a little bit about that. But the key point is that this person, Nellie Francis, was a person of incredible accomplishment. And like so many people in history, and especially women in history and women of color in history, despite their great contributions to society, they have gone unnoticed. And so looking at Nellie Francis, trying to bring her life into the public arena has been something that I hope will, kind of set the record straight, at least in terms of how we look at our history and whatnot. So with no further ado, I'm going to start talking about Nellie and just give you a sense of who she was. You'll see on the monitor, her name was Nellie Griswold Francis. The name itself is interesting in the sense that her middle name was Francis with an E, Frances. And so when she married William Francis, an African-American attorney who would become an attorney, her name was Nellie, would become Nellie Francis Griswold Francis. She dropped, of course, her middle name and just stayed with the three names at the front. But it's just one of the examples of how unique she is in a sense. She was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1874, and at a young age came to Minnesota. Her father, Thomas Griswold, was one of the first African Americans. He had been a slave. He moved to Nashville to basically start his life over again in the wake of the Civil War, and worked his way from that lowly status as a former slave to become a person who would become a fairly successful businessman, as well as one of the first Blacks to serve on the city council of Nashville. So he had a future in Tennessee politics, or at least Nashville politics. He was well known in the community. He and his wife were well known in the community. But he, in taking a trip to the north in behalf of Nashville, they were looking at water systems and whatnot. He noticed the quality of education that Minnesota kids were receiving, particularly in St. Paul. And for that reason, he picked up his family and brought them to relocate to St. Paul. So he basically gave up everything in order to sacrifice for the well-being of his two daughters, Lula and Nellie. Lula was the older of the two daughters. This is a picture of Nellie Francis in a graduation night, the night of her graduation from St. Paul Central. She was the second African-American child to graduate from Central High School. The first African-American child was her older sister, Lula. Nellie was the star, though. She was the person who had stage presence. She was an excellent actor. She wrote plays. She performed in musicals. She was a singer. And she was very, very tiny. But when she entered the stage, got on the stage, everybody was riveted by her presence. She had quite a bit of stage presence. During her graduation ceremony, she offered a presentation, an essay for the competition of graduating seniors. And she came in second place. The person who won, the title of his paper was "Don't Be a Crab," interestingly enough. She, on the other hand, wrote on the race problem. In fact, it was entitled The Race Problem. And it was an interesting title for a young girl to give, especially, and to deliver. You have to think about the sense of character and courage that she had, really, to stand on this huge stage in front of thousands of people, all of whom were white, many of whom were at best ambivalent towards African Americans. That's a hidden story about the nature of race relations in Minnesota in the 1890s. But she's standing on this stage and she's giving a speech about the nature of race relations in America and how racism needed to be addressed. And she was saying things that even the race leaders of her community were not saying. They were inhibited in articulating that reality, putting that out there. And if there's time, perhaps we can talk about why they had issues or why they were reluctant to be as candid as she was. But she basically called it as she saw it. She was quite candid in her assessment of the race problem. And what's interesting about the reception is that the newspaper, first of all, the audience applauded her. They gave her a standing ovation at the end of her speech. These were people who probably never saw themselves supporting any kind of criticism or critique of race relations in America and in Minnesota. But they found themselves being drawn to their feet in adulation of her presentation, her audacity, her intellect, her style, her talent. And the newspapers of St. Paul all sang her praises. Newspapers reflecting all the political views, the conservative, the labor, the Republican paper, which was then the paper of note for the state, but the Democratic press as well, which had never been supportive of African Americans. They all sang her praises. They all thought that she did an excellent job. And one paper in particular, the Black press, referred to her as having the host within her, which is a fairly biblical reference that reflected the importance of religion and Christianity to Nellie and the community in which she grew up. She was viewed, in other words, by the press as an angel with heavenly power to assist God's people. That's a fairly, impressive but inflated notion of a 17-year-old girl, but it nonetheless seemed to reflect a sense of one part of the community that saw her having quite a future, and not just a future that showed her promise, that would advance her interests, but a future that would advance the interests of her race. It seemed to foretell that would be her destiny, in a sense. Her grounding came from her church, though. She belonged to Pilgrim Baptist Church, which was the first African-American church to be founded, and indeed it still exists today. But I found, in understanding the nature of her religious background, I found that that what she experienced was what many women in particular, girls in particular, were experiencing in Black churches throughout the North. So I want to refer to this quote that comes from Evelyn Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent. Church women contested racist ideology and institutions through demands of anti-lynching legislation and an end to segregation laws. Sidebar, this is a time when race relations in America were approaching the nadir, where Blacks and whites were at each other's throats, and where African Americans seemingly on a monthly basis were being lynched all over the nation. Higginbotham continues. They expressed their discontent with both racial and gender discrimination and demanded equal rights for Blacks and women. This was the Black church, advocating voting rights and equal employment and educational opportunities. Black women even drew upon the Bible, the most respected source within their community, to fight for women's rights in the church and in a society in general. Now, they're talking about a time when Nellie would have been still a teenager. But you could see just from this general sense of what the religious experience for African-American women as a result of their experience in the church itself, how this would set the tone for the work that Nellie would embrace for her future, dealing with lynching and dealing with voting rights and equal employment. Now, this would be an example of the work of the church. I apologize for the resolution of this picture. This comes out of the old newspaper. And it's a gathering of African-American men and women in 1902. Now, this group is noteworthy in and of themselves. Right in the front is Booker Washington. You also would see, if the resolution was better, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's standing behind Booker Washington, and T. Thomas Fortune, who was the Dean of Black Journalism at the time, in the next row, and Ida B. Wells, who we may talk a little bit about later on. But all of the big names of the early civil rights movement, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, they all came to St. Paul to discuss the future of civil rights for African Americans. Now, it's interesting to note that, you know, during a time when race relations were really going through a lot of issues, they were experiencing a lot of issues, that these leaders would choose St. Paul, a small city with a small population and a minuscule African-American population. They would choose the site of St. Paul to hold their national conference. If you look around the edges of this gathering, they're all standing outside the front door on the steps. But if you look at the walls, the brick and the stone walls, that is the facade of the state capitol. Now, the state capitol would close. It would change in 1902. So this is one of the last public impressions of the state capitol being used for this kind of quasi-political affair for all intents and purposes. And that says something about Minnesota, which underscores the reason why they came here in the first place. Because the legislature opened up its halls, its chambers, so that Black people could come in and talk about race. This was not happening in any other place in the country. And the person who gave the welcoming address was none other than Governor Gus Van Sant. He was welcomed. He stood and welcomed these Black leaders who would be viewed as troublemakers in other parts of the country. Some of them had bounties on their head for espousing racial equality and whatnot. Here they were welcomed. Now, you know, to talk about the history of race relations in Minnesota, it's not a one-way street. It's not a simple line. It's much more complicated. But at least in this particular moment, the reputation of the state was such that African Americans would be welcomed, and that the celebration of a civil rights imperative would be shared by their white hosts. This is a picture of the first of Minnesota Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. These are the members, and they're seated out in front of Pilgrim Baptist Church. That's Pilgrim Baptist Church, the facade behind them. One of the people who was part of the foundation or the creation of this organization, of the Minnesota chapter at least, was Lula Chapman, who was Nellie's sister, and she would be a leader of this organization for the next couple years. Now, this organization represented what was happening across the nation. African-American women formed the National Colored Women's Club movement. They created this movement in response to what white women were doing. The Colored Women's Club movement would deal with a number of things, both social, but also in terms of education, welfare, and politics, political advancement for African Americans in general. And as time passed, they would become much more active. We'll talk about why they would become more active in a couple slides. But this is the first place where Nellie would begin to develop a political a standing for herself. Before we get there, I want to talk about how she got started. Whenever I talk about leaders, people who would become significant leaders, the question that always comes up from students is, how do they get started? How did they begin to establish themselves as people who a population would come to and seek support from, or would want to follow? How would that person establish themselves in the public eye? And in this particular case, it was Nellie accepting the responsibility of raising money for the pipe organ. Now that's the pipe organ that she was able to buy. You could see it's sort of old and kind of beaten up. It's showing signs of age. But at the time that she purchased it, was able to acquire, it was 1909. And because she was a part of the Black community, there's not a lot of money in the Black community. She was able to raise maybe a third or fourth of what was absolutely needed. But it was critical for the church to have a pipe organ. It was critical for the morale and for the identity and for the prosperity of the church to be able to provide this kind of music, this ambiance where Black people would gather, come together. And so she decided she was going to, in order to get the final sums that she needed to purchase this organ, she takes a trip to New York City. She walks down Riverside Drive to the mansion where Andrew Carnegie lived, went to his house, introduced herself, and asked him for money to donate to the church. This is Andrew Carnegie in the middle. And he gave her the money. He was impressed with her. He gave her the money. And they were able to, as a result of that donation, purchase this organ for the church. She had done all of that for the service of her church. Before she came home from New York, she talked to her husband about it, William Francis, and he was really proud of her and wanted to show her some sort of, indicate his pride of her and his support. He asked her to show this respect for her. He asked her to go to Washington, D.C., of all places, and she did. She was interested in politics. She went down and was met at the train station by the second man with the dark hair and the walrus mustache. This is an image of Moses Clapp, who was a US Senator from Minnesota. He met her at the train station. Moses Clapp and William Francis, who was Nellie's husband, were law students at William Mitchell. The first graduating class of what would become William Mitchell. At the time, it was the St. Paul College of Law. But they were classmates for all intents and purposes, and they maintained a friendship. Moses Clapp took Nellie to the White House, where she would meet the man on the far right, my far right. That's President William Howard Taft. Nellie would eventually meet two other presidents. And so her range of acquaintances would expand just because she was able to organize a campaign to raise funds for an organ. All of the funds went to the purchase of this organ. But her gifts, ability to organize, her gifts, the abilities to articulate a need, to inspire people to contribute, all were the kinds of skills and strengths that the Black community really needed for its new leadership. And so they saw in Nellie the person who would be destined to be their leader. A few years later, she would become elected. She would get elected to become president of the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, 1912. Between 1909, when she raised money to purchase the organ, and the time she was elected, she continued to be very active in her church. She continued to be very active in public education. And she began to be very active in encouraging African-American women to embrace Black suffrage, or the suffrage of women. This was something that was challenging for African-American women to want to fully buy. They wanted to have the right to vote, but the price of getting that suffrage was a little too high. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the price looked like. The price looked like forming alliances with people who did not want to work with them. African Americans, being minorities, did not have enough votes or did not have enough physical presence to persuade the body politic to extend the right to vote to African Americans or to women in general. And white women, the suffragists, were divided as to whether to have any kind of association with Black women. Some of it had to do with some of the suffragists feeling the bias, the racism of the times, but others were also politically pragmatic. They understood that if they were going to be able to persuade Congress to even put the amendment before the body politic, that they would have to have the political support of Southern politicians. And Southerners coming from the Deep South with larger populations of African Americans could count. They could see that if suffrage was indeed extended to all women, then it could be extended to Black women, which means that the balance of power would be shifted away from them. And so for that reason, they were withholding their support and telling suffragist leaders that if you want our support, then you've got to give us and our states the ability to deny Black women the right to vote. And there were white suffragists who were willing to make that compromise. So you have the tensions between Black women and white women in the suffrage community itself. Now that story is just now coming out. There was an article in the New York Times that featured that kind of tension. There was a documentary on women's suffrage that talked about that rather ugly chapter in the women's suffrage history, but it was a history that needed to be told and talks about, you know, how race and gender were uneven and difficult elements to come together, to bring together. As a result, African-American women found it necessary to go it alone, to separate from any effort to socialize with white suffragists. You know, there were times where you found the two groups coming together, but for the most part, the alliance between the two races was hard to establish because of the racial politics that kept the two groups apart. We're entering into a particularly difficult time, as if all of the first part of the 20th century was not difficult. It was incredibly difficult. It only got worse since the turn of the century with regard to race relations, and in particular, the welfare of African Americans. But by 1915, a much more peculiar kind of thing is beginning to happen, even between African Americans and their white allies. And it takes the form of how the community is going to receive a film that is just now beginning to circulate around the nation. It's called Birth of a Nation. Now, you're probably familiar with what this film is about. It glorifies the Klan, it denigrates Reconstruction and the Union side for forcing Reconstruction on the South. It portrayed African Americans, especially African American men, as predatorial, and indeed the film comes to a kind of climax with the lynching of an African American because of his assault on a white woman at the hands of the Klan. The Klan is lynching this African American because of the accusation that he assaulted a white woman. Minnesotans are flocking to this film. It was being shown in Minneapolis at the Schubert Theater, and you couldn't get tickets. People were lining up, flocking to get in, hustling to get in. It was also a very popular film all over the state. It first came to Minnesota by way of Bemidji, and later Duluth. But it was also being viewed in other parts of the state, but principally in the Twin Cities. What was amazing about the film was how people were saying how educational it was. Indeed, this quote, "Its wonderful educational value cannot be overestimated. It should be seen by all." These were the remarks of superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools, 1915. He and a couple dozen other good citizens were appointed by the mayor of the city, Mayor Nye, to actually view the film and make a judgment as to whether it should be banned. The mayor himself had problems with the film, but because it seemed to have a lot of political support, he did not feel comfortable banning the film. And of course, there's a big argument as to, banning being the appropriate response to a film of this nature. But that was the debate in 1915, whether the movie should be banned or not. And as a result of that committee that the mayor selected in Minneapolis, the recommendation was that this was a great film that should be aired. And again, I want to underscore the statement of the superintendent of schools at the time, who says it's a wonderful education value, cannot be overestimated. But what's also noteworthy about the reaction of Minnesotans to the film was how many people who considered themselves the friends of African Americans were viewing the film as a good thing and getting impatient with Black friends who saw it as a harmful thing. African Americans felt that this kind of film could be both incendiary and would be a spark to more racial tension, to more racial violence. And what a lot of the friends, white friends of Black people felt at the time, and they were writing about this in the newspaper, was that African Americans are too sensitive, that they need to just kind of get over it, that white Minnesotans can see this for what it is, and it's a source of entertainment, not to be taken seriously. What they were ignoring was what was going on in other parts of the country at this particular time. I talked about earlier of how race relations were getting much more intense by this time, the second decade of the 20th century. Well, it was getting even worse by the second half of the second decade of the 20th century. This is an example of how such a thing could get worse. And I think it's a perfect example of how African Americans and white Americans lived in parallel worlds. They didn't share the same reality for all intents and purposes. Here I refer to Nellie Francis trying to persuade African American women who she felt needed to be a part of the suffrage movement and needed to form alliances with white women. She knew she was dealing with with the mixed messages of the white women who Black women were, that she hoped would affiliate themselves with. And this is an example of that. In January of 1916, in Albert Lee, the suffrage community, suffrage organization, in an effort to sort of promote the organization itself, used as a means of exciting people to join the suffrage movement, complimentary tickets to view the birth of a nation. Now, if you're trying to impress upon African Americans the fact that the white suffragists were friends of Black people, this is a hard thing to persuade, to do. And you add to this the fact that African Americans were not able to forget or willing to forget. It was for the sense of survival that they couldn't forget their history. You have a situation where as recently as, well, actually it's not that recently to us, but at this particular time, many of the women who Nellie dealt with could remember what it was like for Black people in the wake or during the period of Reconstruction. They could remember that. And they could also remember all of the things that were happening to, at the hands of white supremacists in America during the 20th century. They couldn't forget that. There was a continuity of that kind of reaction between the races that African Americans did not feel that it was wise to forget about. And yet white friends acted as if those actions of supremacy, those actions of denigration, of, they're not what we've done. We're not responsible for what they did. And many of the white friends didn't even regard those as real issues. And so Black people and white people were kind of living in parallel worlds, as I said before. Just as significantly was the sense that African Americans didn't feel like they can trust even their white allies. That's the key thing, because African Americans looked at those at the spread of white supremacy, seemingly as their liberal friends had grown complacent to the spread. They weren't doing anything. And of course, looking at the history of Reconstruction, the Republican Party, which is the party of Lincoln, Friends of African Americans, the party that had fought to keep the Union together and to emancipate the African American and to enfranchise the African American. The friend of the African American basically had control of Congress and the White House and most legislatures in the North, and there was no hue and cry. Even though they controlled all of those bodies, there was no hue and cry to speak of as white supremacy spread across the United States. And furthermore, Jim Crow policies, discriminatory policies that prohibit Blacks from going into restaurants and hotels in the North were pretty much common practice in the North. So the African American, even though, especially those living in the North, understood that they lived on and they operated on thin ice, to use a metaphor for the times we have today. They're living, operating, walking on thin ice, that at any given time, the ice could crack, they could be carried, they could fall through. So then the question becomes, and it seemed to all happen, it seemed to all begin in the wake of the 15th Amendment. Okay, so the question that a lot of African Americans are asking is, would expanded suffrage mean unchecked terror again? We know that in the wake of the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, that's when the Klan started to get in power. That's where the White Camellia, Knights of the White Camellia, another white supremacist group, began to feel a sense of audacity, of being able to turn the clock back, in effect. That's when it began to happen. The fear that once African American men got the right to vote, then in many sections of the South, the white leaders would be outnumbered and therefore their power would be lost. And so the result was to push the tide back, to hold the tide back. The question that a lot of African Americans and African American women in particular were asking at the second half of the 19th century, as we talk about suffrage, granting suffrage to all women and African American women as well, will that lead to yet another period of unchecked terror? Now, Nellie, you have to know, you have to understand, you have to believe, you have to realize, I think you have to assume, for a person who saw the future of any kind of equal rights for African Americans, in a place like Minnesota, where African Americans were desperately in a minority, you needed to have affiliations, alliances with the white population, with white friends, with white allies. That was critical. But that could only happen if the African American population was open to that association. In 1916, Nellie saw what she hoped would be an opening to further indicate or illustrate that all white people were not the same, that indeed there were a lot of white people who could be our friends and who were our friends and were sacrificing a lot in order to be our friends. In 1916, May 1916, a newspaper account appears. You may not be able to read this, so I'll just kind of give you, I'll summarize basically what's going on here. Of an event that's happening, that happened in Detroit. The Detroit Federation of Women's Club, an organization composed of white women's clubs of the city of Detroit, has decided by a vote of the members that it will not affiliate with the National Federation, which is white, unless it will permit the Detroit chapter to allow the Detroit study group comprised of colored women to be a part of the group. In other words, the Detroit Federation of white women had already wanted to integrate their ranks. They wanted to receive African-American women into their number. And the National Federation, their national organization, basically wanted to punish the Detroit club organization because it wanted to open the doors to Black women. They were punishing other white people for being willing to support integration. What Nellie wanted to do was to persuade her own national organization, to persuade the various affiliates around the nation to draft statements of resolution in support of what the Detroit women were doing. She wanted the Black women to support the white women of Detroit and what white women were doing in Detroit, namely trying to integrate their ranks. And this would not turn out well for Nellie for a number of reasons. One of them is, if you look at the bottom of this particular slide, you can see her signature, Mrs. William T. Francis, Chairman, Press Committee, National Association of Colored Women's Club. She's now a national officer. But she signed this resolution as an officer of the national office, and this basically opened her up to criticism by those who were already beginning to criticize Nellie. Nellie had by this time established a national platform for herself. She had already established relationships with some of the nation's most powerful white men. She was known by Booker T. Washington and known to Booker T. Washington, and his wife, Mrs. Booker T. Washington, was a mentor of hers. Nellie seemed to be able to get things done. She seemed to be the preferred leader. And as a result, there was a lot of envy that began to form around her. She developed a number of, there was a lot of hostility that was forming against her, in effect. This was the opportunity for her enemies to attack. They felt that she was getting ahead of herself, that she was getting too prominent, that she needed to be slapped down. And so as a result, in the wake of this resolution that she sent out, and in response or reaction to the criticism, quiet criticism, that a number of the members of the colored organizations had against her, she was ultimately excommunicated. And so she's out in the wilderness, for all intents and purposes. She's out in the wilderness. She does not have any kind of portfolio. She doesn't have any kind of connection with the sisters she once was close to, in the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She was basically out in the open, out in the wilderness. Meanwhile, nationally, race relations are just as explosive. In 1917, this is the year after the time she's excommunicated, 1917, we have the race riots of East St. Louis. And you can see in the cartoon down here, I don't know if you can actually read it. It's occurring in East St. Louis where hundreds
of white laborers descend on the Black community, destroy property and kill people. And here is what a cartoonist really sort of captured, that the white man is Wilson, President Wilson. And in his hand, he has a proclamation, a sort of an offshoot of what he had been famous for, making the world famous or safe for democracy. He would like to, she's basically pleading with him to make the world safe for America. And interestingly enough, though African Americans of both genders are being shot, you can see in the newspaper account next to this cartoon, burned, clubbed to death. The cartoonist uses the image of an African American woman protecting the children. It is as if to say that the African American woman is the moral presence of the outrage, the nature of the outrage. By the way, the circumstances that led to the race riots in East St. Louis, 1970, were the same factors leading to the race riots or to the lynchings in Duluth 3 years later. And we'll come to that later. Now, about the same time, Nellie is trying to figure out what she's going to do with her life. And she knows that she wants to get involved with the suffrage movement. She never really left it, but she's not sure how to proceed. I might also say that, I'm going to take a little digression here. I think she went through a period of depression during this particular point. After each one of these setbacks, she went to their cabin in Chisago and would be there for weeks and months. And everybody, to be in Minnesota means that you go to your cabin, and I think we all dream of being at the cabin longer than we probably should. And so maybe what she did is not that unusual, except that the women in her family seemed to suffer from bouts of depression. Now, I'm saying that advisedly, okay? Because there didn't seem to be the kind of diagnosis of what Nellie was going through. For example, her older sister went through a similar bout, but what her doctor did was to force her to stop reading and to lay in bed and to stay there. At a certain point, she was permitted to sit up and drink milk. I learned, I think it was the Yellow Wallpaper, which was a book written about one writer's experience with depression and how the medical community, very patriarchal, tended to look at women of gifts who went through these dark moments, so to speak. It was undiagnosed in an effective way, not really understanding or really caring, because the health and welfare of women was not of a sort that the patriarchy of society would respect or be concerned with. It was easier to put a woman who was depressed for whatever reason in an insane asylum. There are all kinds of stories of that occurring. And I think to some extent, this is what was going on with Nellie. The difficulty of unearthing that part of the history is that all you have really are the documents of the people of the time. And these kinds of issues were not discussed by people in proper society, so to speak. And medicine, the medical community, did not address it either. And so what we have basically here is a whole bunch of question marks about what's going on. I'm not sure, and to sum this up, I'm not sure what exactly was going on with Nellie, but it seemed as if she had to withdraw in order to deal with whatever. In any event, she begins to come out of this depression, or this period, this phase. And this is about the time when the Women's Suffrage Association undergoes a change. It selects a new president. It is this person will be the 13th president that the organization would have. And this person would be a genius in terms of organization. This is Clara Ueland. She was way beyond her time in terms of understanding the significance of organization and education. She wanted all of her lieutenants to be well-versed in coordinating movements. And she wanted them to know how to public speak. She wanted them to write effectively. She emphasized the significance of leadership training for her people. And she was always on the lookout for talent. A mutual friend, in fact, a couple mutual friends of Nellie Francis and Clara Ueland, in effect brought these two people together. And in their first meeting, Clara Ueland was not that impressed with the leadership, with the other members of the suffrage club that Nellie had started. She wasn't all that impressed with them, but she was absolutely impressed with Nellie Francis, referring to her as possessing the spirit of a flame. They would become very good friends. And Clara Ueland would mentor Nellie Francis in terms of working a constituency and mobilizing a lobbying effort for the legislature. And I think it was as a result of that connection and Nellie's experience that she would have in ultimately working with trying to get the legislature to support the 19th Amendment, which they would do in 1919. I think this comes in large part from the training that she was able to couple both from Clara Ueland and her own natural skills. A year later, she finally comes out and decides to start anew. And she publishes an article in both the St. Paul Pioneer Press, largely white audience, and also with the Western Appeal. I'm sorry, the Western Appeal is what the newspaper was once called. It's just the Appeal. That was the Black newspaper, and that was a newspaper that African Americans read. To excerpt part of what she said, she writes, "This broad united stand of the suffrage body for the principles of democracy, which must include Black women as well as white, will win for the cause of suffrage many sympathizers who would otherwise have been indifferent to its success. The cause of suffrage will triumph, for it is just." Now she's talking to a couple different groups here. She's announcing the need for Black women and white women to come together. She's announcing that, but she's also telling Black women not to view suffrage as a white thing, that you can't be indifferent to the significance of the ballot. Don't be distracted by the history of race relations. Don't be distracted by your experiences with white people. We have to know how to work with all kinds of folks in order to advance this agenda. And it's a challenging thing for her to be persuasive and for her to be saying persuasively, because we're entering into the time called the Red Summer, 1919, where racist savagery becomes even more normalized than it had been in the past. In the period from late winter through early autumn, white supremacist terrorism and white on Black riots took place in more than 36 cities across the country, including Washington, Norfolk, Virginia, Omaha, Wilmington, Chicago. I mean, virtually every section of the country is affected by these kinds of conflicts. In Arkansas, within one evening, an estimated 240 Black people and 5 white people were killed, an event now known as the Elaine Massacre. It was a period when Black lives mattered even less. Nonetheless, a year later, 1919, the state is able to ratify the 19th Amendment. Now, this is the time period where the 19th Amendment is circulating among the states, okay? You have to get the states to approve this. And when it came to Minnesota, the legislature approved it. The 19th Amendment would be ultimately ratified a year later in August of 1920. But 1919 was a time for great celebration, as you can see on the right side of this excerpt from the newspaper. State women celebrated suffrage wins. Senate chamber rings with songs and applause upon ratification. Leaders in enfranchisement fight. And legislators exchange congratulations. And so in the midst of that victory, while white suffragists celebrated, even though Black women now had the right to vote, or would have the right to vote, that would not be secured for another several months, they still remain cautious of the lessons of Reconstruction. When things get bad, will our new white friends stand by us? June 15th, 1920, this happens in Duluth. Now, the lynchings of 3 Black men are not due to women's suffrage. But for a people who are used to seeing the welfare, the political and social and economic welfare of African Americans, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, this is connected to the larger story. About a year later, Nellie would begin her famous campaign to get an anti-lynching bill passed, and she would succeed. The vote tally tells the whole story. In the House, the bill passes 81-1, and in the Senate, 41-0. So it's a virtually unanimous vote. And with this, Nellie Francis is a star. I mean, her presence, her significance, her success is elevated even higher. This isn't stuff that she's going for. She's not soaking up or in need of that kind of public adulation. But people are putting her, in effect, on their shoulders. She is their champion. At a commemoration at Pilgrim Baptist Church to celebrate her victory, the recognizing her success, one of her allies, Charles Miller, Reverend, states for the first time the nature of criticism that Nellie has had to deal with, and he defends her. Unlike many others of the race with equal advantage who have dodged behind pillars and posts to get away from the race, you, he's talking about Nellie, have brought the race up with you. Nellie had to deal with a number of accusations that she was in it for self-interest, and she had never enriched herself, but still the accusations persisted. Miller goes on to say, "So mind not what others say or think in these matters concerning you and the race. Live so as to make the most of the life God had given you, and let the tongues wag as they may. It is a sad mistake to say there are only 7 deadly sins. There are 8, and ingratitude is the first." And then Nellie gets up and speaks. And this is really the last time she will speak. She says, and maybe the last and the only time that she will acknowledge the kinds of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune she had been having to deal with. And this is our last known image of Nellie Francis. We must frown from all the strength of our minds upon the destructive and selfish agencies and efforts to hinder earnest and altruistic service, and have courage
to enlist the cooperation of those who would sponsor our cause and be of service. Let us present a united front. So she's clearly calling for the integration of the races, the unity of the races. This is what we can do if we work together, is what she's saying. She will retire. That's her last public appearance. She and Billy will leave their house on St. Anthony Avenue and will move to this house, 2092 Sargent Street. It is, you know, she had been wounded by all of the accusations that she had to deal with over the years. And I believe that once this anti-lynching law campaign was passed, then she felt like she could leave the community. She had had enough. She was retiring. But in moving into this house, the white neighbors had circulated a resolution. Colored persons are not wanted in this district. So they're walking right into that period of restrictive covenant for housing. Nellie and Billy resisted harassment to move, but they were alone in this. And this is what I think is most noteworthy of this particular chapter. As as Paul Nelson, who wrote the article, a biography of William T. Francis that appeared in the Ramsey County History magazine, as he writes, when word got out the Francis's decade of public service, leadership, Republican politics, and middle-class respectability counted for nothing. By that, we're saying this: despite all the contacts they had made, all the good deeds that they had made, despite all that they had left behind and all they had done to advance the civility of the state, no one came to their defense. No one came to their defense. In 1927, President Calvin Coolidge appoints William Francis to be consul to Liberia. And so this is their opportunity to leave not only St. Paul, but the country. They moved to Liberia. He unearths a forced working slave labor operation in Liberia, founded by US and British companies. And in late 1929, he gets ill. He dies of yellow fever. And so she returns. She brings the body back to America. But she has no intention of moving back into St. Paul. She has by this time decided to move to Nashville. And for the next 40 years, hence, she lived without much association with Minnesota. I might also add that she had to lobby Congress to get the funds to bring his body from St. Paul to Nashville. They came back to St. Paul because they had, people wanted to show their respects, and then she was going to take him to Nashville. But there were no funds to take him to Nashville. Congress would not cover the funds. The State Department would not cover the funds. And so for the next 3 years, Nellie had to lobby Congress in order to subsidize the transporting of his body. She would finally die on December 13th, 1969. So even though she comes back from a full life, she has another 40 years to live. That's another thing about the history, the study of Nellie Francis. She'd only lived half her life in Minnesota. And once she left, she had another half of her life to live. And it was in relative anonymity. She dies finally, as I said, December 13th, 1969, at age 95. She is blind and she's deaf, but she's still working at Tennessee State University. She's not as active, as you can imagine, in civil rights. And she's thinking that the progress of civil rights is stalled, if not beginning to recede, because she's looking at Jim Crow policies, discrimination policies, deepening in Nashville and in Tennessee. But she does live long enough to see the torch get passed. This is Diane Nash, who's leading the Nashville sit-in movement of 1960. She was a student when Nellie was working at the university. And there's a sense of recognition and a sense of completion, continuation of the work that she had started earlier on. So with that, I'm going to stop. And I'm interested in any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you do. So what was she doing? What did she do as a job when she was at the University of Tennessee?
She was a clerk.
Okay.
She was a clerk. She had a job as a typist. Yes, she was blind and she had a job as a typist.
And did she make, yeah.
In her 80s and into the 90s. And so, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Did she maintain relationships with her sister who was back in Minnesota?
No, actually, her sister died before they even left Minnesota. Okay. One reason why they moved into the house on Sargent Street was because it was a little larger than where they were. And her sister was ill again. And so, had never really gotten well. And so the sister moved in with her husband, moved in to the Francis household. And so they stayed together until her sister died in 1924. So basically she was alone. She moved to Nashville because her grandmother was still living, and her grandmother would live until the age of 117. And she would remain active. And also Nellie's aunt, her mother's younger sister, was a very active civil rights leader in Nashville. So when she left when she left St. Paul, the Minnesota family had all passed. Okay. Her sister, her closest friend, had died. When she moved back to when she moved to Nashville, she basically was reconnecting with an older branch of her family. And so, but she would ultimately die alone.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm very curious about that time when she was working on the anti-lynching bill, and then the 1924 later, between Red Summer in 1924 and an almost unanimous vote. I'm curious how that sort of unfolded. She clearly was a very charismatic leader, and yet here were lynchings in Duluth, or Red Summer, lynchings in Duluth, and 4 years later, or 3 years later, nobody's standing up for her and her family when they want to move. So I just, like, the nearly unanimous vote really got my attention in that context. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit more in that. And wow, awesome, super. I am so excited about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That is an excellent question. And I think it really goes to the heart of the racial legacy of Minnesota. We have a state that is, in terms of policy, public policy, very progressive, but it still had deep-seated racism within it. And an example of that was the fact that you could have the lynchings occur in Duluth. This was at the same time, as the 3 Black men were being lynched, the governor of the state, J.A. Burnquist, was president of the NAACP. So what that tells me is that Minnesota, with regard to race relations, was a tale of two cities, in effect. It was, on one hand, a place where policymakers and opinion makers were high-minded and could be high-minded in terms of passing policies that suggested tolerance and whatnot. But that high-mindedness was not a part of the body politic. It had not been something that had seeped into the thinking of the common Minnesotan. It was kept in the halls of public leadership, perhaps for public relations purposes. Like I said, the Booker T. Washington and Ida B. Wells and Du Bois and all of these Black leaders who had a pulse on what was going on across the country all felt that St. Paul was progressive. And yet, at the end of that conference, when they all left in Minneapolis, a gang of white toughs attacked a Black guy, banjo player, on the streets of Minneapolis. They chased him, and they told the police, if you don't arrest him because he said bad things to us, this is what the white group is saying about the Black guy. The police went after and arrested the Black guy. So you have these two worlds happening. You're absolutely right in seeing a contradiction here. You're absolutely right in seeing a paradox. That's the nature of race relations in Minnesota. High-mindedness, policymakers who make those policies, those high-minded policies, who don't seem to be able to translate that high-mindedness into the common thinking of the body politic itself, of the average Minnesotan, that there seems to be a gulf between those two people. And the question is, why would the commoner vote for a person who's high-minded? You know, I mean, how is it that a person like Hubert Humphrey, mayor of Minneapolis in the 40s, would become a US Senator in 1948, just on the threshold of the rise of McCarthy, of Joe McCarthy. You know, I mean, now that's the national thing, but the fear of communism was very much a part of what was going on beneath the surface in Minnesota during that same time. And it's the reason why I find Minnesota so absolutely compelling, because I'm from Louisiana, I'm from New Orleans, and I was not born there, I was born in Massachusetts, but I'm from Louisiana, where policymakers had no interest in saying anything that indicated high-minded sensibility about race or about Black people. Coming to Minnesota, you would think that the leadership reflected the thinking of the body politic, but there's a void between the two. And we're seeing it as early as the 1920s and even as early as the 1890s. I mean, the reception of Nellie Francis's speech in 1893, I think it was 94, when she gave that speech, talking about the problem with race, and that we are the source, not we, society is the source of racism. We need to get a grip on it. She's saying these things, and policymakers and opinion makers and the citizenry, applaud, except within a couple years, you have 2 near lynchings, just blocks away from where this assembly occurred. May 1895, a Black man is nearly lynched on the corner of Eigelhart and Lexington. And just 2 months later, a Black man is nearly lynched in the shadow of the state capitol. This is all in 1895. And yet no one talks about that. At least the Black press didn't cover it. So there's a kind of conspiracy of silence of that darker side of the character of what's going on in the body politic of Minnesota. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't put words to it. It's too ugly, and so we don't. And in contrast with what's happening across the country, there's a sharp relief, sharp contrast between what appears to be happening in Minnesota and what we see happening in other parts of the country. And it conveys a false message about where we really are in terms of race.
Were there other states in the country at that time where the political leadership was progressive with respect to race and the citizenry was as well, or was that dichotomy something that was evident like nationally, or is that something that you think in your research is unique to Minnesota?
I don't think it's unique to Minnesota. We're in the limelight. We're in the nation spotlight. I think that, when you look at Massachusetts, for example, that has a history of progressive policies and leadership and things of that nature, you also had the Klan having a very active chapter in the 1920s and the 30s. So it seemed to be something that was not unusual. Minnesota didn't seem to be unusual in that regard. And in a weird way, in a very, very weird way, that makes people feel kind of disappointed because there's a sense of exceptionalism that
right.
Minnesota, and here's an example of how we want to be exceptional because we don't want other states to be like us. But here's the sad story behind it. Wisconsin had problems, with race. Many of the New England states had problems with race. And I mean, post-Civil War, 19th century, early part of the 20th century. It is, and this is what Nellie was talking about in her message, in effect, in her statement, that this is a national problem. This isn't just a problem in St. Paul. She's looking at St. Paul. She's looking at Minnesota, but it's a national problem. And, for Americans of that time to see this exclusively as a Southern phenomenon allowed people to just sort of allowed this dynamic to nurture, to fester, because it was unattended.
Right.
And I think it is what's going on now. What people are saying, look, let's look at systemic racism. We don't know what it means, but let's deal with it. So no, I don't think of any state that was exempt, that
right.
was free of it.
We've got a couple more minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions?
Do you have any thoughts or hypotheses about why she went silent in the last 4 decades of her life?
I think she retired. I think emotionally she had retired from public service. She was still active in her church. She had joined a church that she was actually born into, but she basically, I think, decided that she had had enough of public service and wanted to just, be a servant to her congregation. And she was involved with educational activities for children and programs of that nature. But she didn't want to get into the rough and tumble, the whole kind of political thing that she had been involved with, both on a national level and on the state level. I think she had grown weary of that. And, I frankly would have a hard time saying that she didn't have a right to peace. And I think she found a lot of peace in those quieter pursuits. She would take trips. She would come back to St. Paul occasionally, but she wouldn't stay with her friends or with people who said that she was that they were friends. She would stay in a hotel, usually the St. Paul Hotel downtown St. Paul, and would only be in town for a short time, and then she would leave. So it was as if she maintained friendships with individuals, but not with the community. And she had just decided, I paid my dues and I'm going to live out my life in quietude. She would still be recognized, though. It's an interesting thing. The opening scene in my book, it has her being recognized by the women's community of Nashville, but only for her deeds in Nashville. There's no reference to her work in Minnesota. It's as if, the shade was pulled down on that time in her life. And she didn't seem to have any interest in, letting people know about that time in her life. So to answer your question, I think she just was ready to hang it up, so to speak, in terms of public engagement. Now her aunt was still very active in civil rights stuff. And as I said, her grandmother, up until the time she passed, was active in civil rights stuff. But I think Nellie had retired for all intents and purposes.
Well, it sounds like rightly so. I think unless there are other questions, I think I'm going to thank Bill Green for his presentation tonight. It's been really fascinating. And if you are interested in, sorry, I'm always terrible at this. If you're interested in any of Bill's other books, you can purchase them at any of our local independent bookstores in Minnesota. You can also get them from the Minnesota History Center. And so you can see Nellie Francis's, his newest book over there on my right. And these other books are also books about civil rights in Minnesota. And there's definitely a lot of great stuff there. So thank you, Bill, for that.
Thank you.
If you're interested in our next talk, yeah, thank you. If you're interested, our next speaker will be Shannon Gibney, who's a novelist, and she'll be speaking at 7 p.m. on February 23rd. And if you would like to register for that, you can do that at our website. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you very much, and be careful going home.
Yeah, that's right.